Part One, Chapter 2, Section 1 of The Possessed by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Translated by Constance Garnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 2, Section 1. Prince Harry, Matchmaking. There was another being in the world to whom Varvara Petrovna was as much attached as she was to Stepan Trofimovitch, her only son Nikolay Vsyevolodovitch Stavrogin. It was to undertake his education that Stepan Trofimovitch had been engaged. The boy was at that time 8 years old, and his frivolous father, General Stavrogin, was already living apart from Varvara Petrovna, so that the child grew up entirely in his mother's care. To do Stepan Trofimovitch justice, he knew how to win his pupil's heart. The whole secret of this lay in the fact that he was a child himself. I was not there in those days, and he continually felt the want of a real friend. He did not hesitate to make a friend of this little creature as soon as he had grown a little older. It somehow came to pass quite naturally that there seemed to be no discrepancy of age between them. More than once he awaked his 10 or 11-year-old friend at night simply to pour out his wounded feelings and weep before him, or to tell him some family secret without realizing that this was an outrageous proceeding. They threw themselves into each other's arms and wept. The boy knew that his mother loved him very much, but I doubt whether he cared much for her. She talked little to him and did not often interfere with him, but he was always morbidly conscious of her intent, searching eyes fixed upon him. Yet the mother confided his whole instruction and moral education to Stepan Trofimovitch. At that time her faith in him was unshaken. One can't help believing that the tutor had rather a bad influence on his pupil's nerves. When at 16 he was taken to a lyceum he was fragile looking and pale, strangely quiet and dreamy. Later on he was distinguished by great physical strength. One must assume, too, that the friends went on weeping at night, throwing themselves in each other's arms, though their tears were not always due to domestic difficulties. Stepan Trofimovitch succeeded in reaching the deepest chords in his pupil's heart, and had aroused in him a first vague sensation of that eternal, sacred yearning which some elect souls can never give up for cheap gratification when once they have tasted and known it. There are some connoisseurs who prize this yearning more than the most complete satisfaction of it, if such were possible. But in any case it was just as well that the pupil and the preceptor were, though none too soon, parted. For the first 2 years the lad used to come home from the lyceum for the holidays. While Varvara Petrovna and Stepan Trofimovitch were staying in Petersburg, he was sometimes present at the literary evenings at his mother's. He listened and looked on. He spoke little, and was quiet and shy as before. His manner to Stepan Trofimovitch was as affectionately attentive as ever, but there was a shade of reserve in it. He unmistakably avoided distressing lofty subjects or reminiscences of the past. By his mother's wish he entered the army on completing the school course, and soon received a commission in one of the most brilliant regiments of the Horse Guards. He did not come to show himself to his mother in his uniform, and his letters from Petersburg began to be infrequent. Varvara Petrovna sent him money without stint, though after the emancipation the revenue from her estate was so diminished that at first her income was less than half what it had been before. She had, however, a considerable sum laid by through years of economy. She took great interest in her son's success in the highest Petersburg society. Where she had failed, the wealthy young officer with expectations succeeded. He renewed acquaintances which she had hardly dared to dream of, and was welcomed everywhere with pleasure. But very soon rather strange rumours reached Varvara Petrovna. The young man had suddenly taken to riotous living with a sort of frenzy. Not that he gambled or drank too much; there was only talk of savage recklessness, of running over people in the street with his horses, of brutal conduct to a lady of good society with whom he had a liaison, and whom he afterwards publicly insulted. There was a callous nastiness about this affair. It was added, too, that he had developed into a regular bully, insulting people for the mere pleasure of insulting them. Varvara Petrovna was greatly agitated and distressed. Stepan Trofimovitch assured her that this was only the first riotous effervescence of a too richly endowed nature, that the storm would subside, and that this was only like the youth of Prince Harry, who caroused with Falstaff, Poins, and Mrs. Quickly, as described by Shakespeare. This time Varvara Petrovna did not cry out "Nonsense, nonsense," as she was very apt to do in later years in response to Stepan Trofimovitch. On the contrary, she listened very eagerly, asked him to explain this theory more exactly, took up Shakespeare herself and with great attention read the immortal Chronicle. But it did not comfort her, and indeed she did not find the resemblance very striking. With feverish impatience she awaited answers to some of her letters. She had not long to wait for them. The fatal news soon reached her that Prince Harry had been involved in two duels almost at once, was entirely to blame for both of them, had killed one of his adversaries on the spot and had maimed the other, and was awaiting his trial in consequence. The case ended in his being degraded to the ranks, deprived of the rights of a nobleman, and transferred to an infantry line regiment, and he only escaped worse punishment by special favour. In 1863 he somehow succeeded in distinguishing himself. He received a cross, was promoted to be a non commissioned officer, and rose rapidly to the rank of an officer. During this period Varvara Petrovna dispatched perhaps hundreds of letters to the capital, full of prayers and supplications. She even stooped to some humiliation in this extremity. After his promotion the young man suddenly resigned his commission, but he did not come back to Skvoreshniki again, and gave up writing to his mother altogether. They learned by roundabout means that he was back in Petersburg, but that he was not to be met in the same society as before. He seemed to be in hiding. They found out that he was living in strange company, associating with the dregs of the population of Petersburg, with slipshod government clerks, discharged military men, beggars of the higher class, and drunkards of all sorts; that he visited their filthy families, spent days and nights in dark slums and all sorts of low haunts, that he had sunk very low, that he was in rags, and that apparently he liked it. He did not ask his mother for money, he had his own little estate, once the property of his father General Stavrogin, which yielded at least some revenue, and which, it was reported, he had let to a German from Saxony. At last his mother besought him to come to her, and Prince Harry made his appearance in our town. I had never set eyes on him before, but now I got a very distinct impression of him. He was a very handsome man of 25, and I must own I was impressed by him. I had expected to see a dirty ragamuffin, sodden with drink and debauchery. He was, on the contrary, the most elegant gentleman I had ever met, extremely well dressed, with an air and manner only to be found in a man accustomed to culture and refinement. I was not the only person surprised. It was a surprise to all the townspeople, to whom of course young Stavrogin's whole biography was well known in its minutest details, though one could not imagine how they had got hold of them, and, what was still more surprising, half of their stories about him turned out to be true. All our ladies were wild over the new visitor. They were sharply divided into two parties, one of which adored him while the other half regarded him with a hatred that was almost bloodthirsty, but both were crazy about him. Some of them were particularly fascinated by the idea that he had perhaps a fateful secret hidden in his soul. Others were positively delighted at the fact that he was a murderer. It appeared, too, that he had had a very good education, and was indeed a man of considerable culture. No great acquirements were needed, of course, to astonish us. But he could judge also of very interesting everyday affairs, and, what was of the utmost value, he judged of them with remarkable good sense. I must mention as a peculiar fact that almost from the first day we all of us thought him a very sensible fellow. He was not very talkative, he was elegant without exaggeration, surprisingly modest, and at the same time bold and self‐reliant, as none of us were. Our dandies gazed at him with envy and were completely eclipsed by him. His face, too, impressed me. His hair was of a peculiarly intense black, his light‐coloured eyes were peculiarly light and calm, his complexion was peculiarly soft and white. The red in his cheeks was too bright and clear, his teeth were like pearls, and his lips like coral. One would have thought that he must be a paragon of beauty, yet at the same time there seemed something repellent about him. It was said that his face suggested a mask. So much was said, though, among other things, they talked of his extraordinary physical strength. He was rather tall. Varvara Petrovna looked at him with pride, yet with continual uneasiness. He spent about 6 months among us. Listless, quiet, rather morose. He made his appearance in society, and with unfailing propriety performed all the duties demanded by our provincial etiquette. He was related on his father's side to the governor, and was received by the latter as a near kinsman. But a few months passed, and the wild beast showed his claws. I may observe, by the way, in parenthesis, that Ivan Ossipovitch, our dear mild governor, was rather like an old woman, though he was of good family and highly connected, which explains the fact that he remained so long among us, though he steadily avoided all the duties of his office. From his munificence and hospitality he ought rather to have been a marshal of nobility of the good old days than a governor in such busy times as ours. It was always said in the town that it was not he but Varvara Petrovna who governed the province. Of course this was said sarcastically, however, it was certainly a falsehood. And indeed much wit was wasted on the subject among us. On the contrary, in later years Varvara Petrovna purposely and consciously withdrew from anything like a position of authority, and, in spite of the extraordinary respect in which she was held by the whole province, voluntarily confined her influence within strict limits set up by herself. Instead of these higher responsibilities she suddenly took up the management of her estate and, within 2 or 3 years, raised the revenue from it almost to what it had yielded in the past. Giving up her former romantic impulses trips to Petersburg, plans for founding a magazine, and so on she began to be careful and to save money. She kept even Stepan Trofimovitch at a distance, allowing him to take lodgings in another house, a change for which he had long been worrying her under various pretexts. Little by little Stepan Trofimovitch began to call her a prosaic woman, or, more jestingly, my prosaic friend. I need hardly say he only ventured on such jests in an extremely respectable form, and on rare and carefully chosen occasions. All of us in her intimate circle felt Stepan Trofimovitch more acutely than any of us that her son had come to her almost, as it were, as a new hope, and even as a sort of new aspiration. Her passion for her son dated from the time of his successes in Petersburg society, and grew more intense from the moment that he was degraded in the army. Yet she was evidently afraid of him, and seemed like a slave in his presence. It could be seen that she was afraid of something vague and mysterious which she could not have put into words, and she often stole searching glances at Nicolas, scrutinizing him reflectively, and behold, the wild beast suddenly showed his claws. End of Chapter 2, Section 1. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.